Okay, so today we are going to talk about another Harlem Renaissance artist named James Van Der Zee. James Van Der Zee was born in 1886 and he died in 1983. He was born in Lenox, Massachusetts, and was a very gifted musician from a young age. He originally wanted to be a professional violinist. Photography was kind of his second interest, his like secondary passion. In 1906, he moved to Harlem. He was also a skilled pianist, so he really had a lot of like musical talents as well as being a gifted photographer. He was the primary creator and one of five performers in a group known as the Harlem Orchestra, which, if you're interested in the history of music at all, particularly American music at all, look up the Harlem Orchestra. It's really fascinating, really influential, fabulous group of musicians. In 1915, he moves to Newark, New Jersey, and he gets a job in a portrait studio because remember, he had this kind of secondary interest in photography. And he then returns to Harlem the next year and sets up a studio in the Toussaint Conservatory of Art and Music with his sister, whose name was Ginny Louise Van Der Zee, who is better known as Madame E. Toussaint, who founded the conservatory in 1911. So, another kind of family connection within what's happening in the Harlem music and art scene. During the 20s and 30s, he produced hundreds of photographs recording Harlem's growing middle class. His style was reminiscent, of Victorian visual traditions. He worked mostly in studio with very stylized backgrounds with architectural elements. This isn't one of those examples, obviously. He retouched negatives heavily to achieve kind of an aura of glamour. He would kind of do manual editing on negatives before printing the photographs from them. So kind of like Photoshop pre-Photoshop existing, right? Like a manual kind of version of that, which is pretty cool. He also photographed the dead for families at funerals. And these works were later collected into a book called The Harlem Book of the Dead, which is also kind of an iconic touchstone in the history of photography and portraiture. It had a foreword, the Harlem Book of the Dead. The foreword was written by none other than Toni Morrison, who is one of my favorite authors of all time, and is also a Nobel Prize winner, so a pretty huge deal. This work is emblematic of the other kind of work he did with photography outside of the studio, where he would capture more candid images of residents of Harlem in the city, going to events, and kind of showed this other sort of look at what was happening in Harlem culturally that clashed with these preconceived prejudicial notions that people had about what it meant to be from Harlem. So pretty glamorous, kind of documenting the glamour of this growing upper middle class in Harlem at that time. And personally, I think his candid photographs are super interesting and give such a nice insight into what was happening in this very important art historical moment, the Harlem Renaissance. So James Van Der Zee, a very influential photographer in several different fronts, and also a really important musician in the Harlem Renaissance.